Thorpe Abbotts, England, March 1944. In the personal equipment shop of the 100th Bomb Group, a staff sergeant examines an A-14 oxygen mask returned from the previous day's mission to Brunswick. The rubber facepiece shows no visible cracks. The demand regulator tests within specification. Yet the waist gunner who wore it reported a blackout at 24,000 feet, his third oxygen incident in 5 missions. The sergeant reaches for Technical Order 0351 and a hose clamp torque gauge. What he discovers in the next 20 minutes, a connection loose enough to pass visual inspection but tight enough to leak under altitude and vibration, represents one data point in a larger transformation. Across the 8th and 15th Air Forces, personal equipment riggers are systematically eliminating the small mechanical failures that, in 1942 and early 1943, caused thousands of hypoxia incidents at altitude. By war's end, this unglamorous work will reduce anoxia accidents among heavy bomber crews by roughly 70 to 80%, even as average mission altitude rises 5,000 feet and sortie rates increase more than 100-fold. This is the story of how technical precision in a cold equipment shop became one of the sharpest statistical improvements in the strategic air war. An operations planner slides a ruler across an altitude profile chart for proposed B-17 missions over Germany. The line settles at 22,000 to 25,000 feet, high enough, the planners calculate, to reduce flak effectiveness while maintaining formation cohesion and bomb accuracy. The 8th Air Force will wage daylight precision bombing at altitudes where the air pressure is less than half that at sea level, where unprotected men lose consciousness in minutes, and where every breath depends on a system of cylinders, regulators, hoses, and masks functioning without error for 8 to 10 hours per mission. The oxygen system architecture in B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators consists of low-pressure gaseous oxygen stored in cylinders at roughly 450 pounds per square inch, distributed through manifolds to individual crew positions, regulated by demand valves that sense breathing, and delivered through masks that must seal against the face under vibration, cold, and the constant movement of combat operations. Contemporary aeromedical research classifies hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, as an invisible threat that impairs judgment before the victim recognizes danger. Above 20,000 feet, time of useful consciousness without supplemental oxygen can be measured in minutes. By war's end, U.S. Army Air Forces records will document 10,700 hypoxia-related incidents during World War II, 110 deaths directly attributed to oxygen system failures, and between 0.3 and 0.6% of all sorties aborted due to oxygen problems. Behind each incident statistic lies a mission compromised, a crew endangered, and often an aircraft vulnerable. The Air Service Command and Maintenance Division bear formal responsibility for oxygen system technical orders. The Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field studies altitude physiology. But the daily battle against hypoxia will be fought by men whose names rarely appear in official histories: the personal equipment riggers, parachute specialists, and oxygen technicians who inspect, repair, and modify masks and hoses between missions. An early AAF training manual states, "A vital portion of his training concerned the body in flight. The entire high-altitude bombing concept depends on oxygen equipment working as designed. Early accident reports will show this assumption is fragile. At 25,000 feet, a loose hose clamp or degraded face seal transforms from a maintenance defect into a life-threatening failure." In a hypobaric chamber at Wright Field, a technician monitors pressure gauges as the simulated altitude climbs past 30,000 feet. A test subject wearing an A-14 oronasal demand oxygen mask performs arithmetic problems and writes simple sentences. The mask, evolved from the earlier BLB nasal design developed by Boothby, Lovelace, and Bulbulian at the Mayo Clinic, incorporates a rubber facepiece that covers nose and mouth, a demand valve that delivers oxygen on inhalation, exhalation valves that expel carbon dioxide, and a corrugated hose with metal connector ends that links the mask to the aircraft oxygen system. Laboratory results indicate that properly fitted A14 masks with functioning regulators can maintain adequate oxygenation up to 35,000 feet. Yet, within months of the 8th Air Force's first combat missions over occupied Europe, medical officers reviewing debrief forms encounter a troubling pattern. Crews report blackouts, impaired judgment, and loss of consciousness at altitudes well within the A14's rated performance envelope. Incident reports cite oxygen failure, mask malfunction, and equipment defect, but initial investigations often find that the same masks and regulators test satisfactorily on the ground. The gap between laboratory capability and operational reliability points toward failure modes that emerge only under actual mission conditions: extreme cold at altitude, aircraft vibration, crew fatigue, and the physical demands of combat. NASA's later technical summary describes the A-14 as designed to be frost-proof, capable of speech while worn, and compatible with flight helmets and throat microphones. The design intent is sound, but field reports from bomber groups describe masks freezing at inlet ports, hose connections loosening under vibration, face seals degrading after repeated use, and exhalation valves sticking in cold conditions. A post-war physiological review will note that early anoxia deaths resulted partly from faulty design of the first AAF oxygen masks combined with inadequate training. But the review will also emphasize that systematic improvements in maintenance procedures proved as important as design modifications. The Mayo Clinic team established the foundation. Wright Field engineers refined the hardware. But making the A-14 system reliable at operational scale requires a different kind of expertise: the hands-on knowledge of personal equipment specialists who understand how rubber ages, how metal fittings respond to torque and vibration, and how small defects propagate under stress. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, a directive establishes the position of Personal Equipment Officer in every flying unit, effective immediately. The PEO bears responsibility for all life support equipment: parachutes, life rafts, heated clothing, survival gear, and, critically, oxygen systems. Each bomber group will assign an officer to this role, supported by enlisted personal equipment specialists, parachute riggers, and oxygen technicians. The mandate is explicit: maintain all personal equipment in perfect condition and train every crew member in its proper use. The organizational chart now shows a clear chain of responsibility from the 8th Air Force Surgeon's Office through Group PEOs to the enlisted men in equipment shops. Technical Order 002513, Your Body in Flight, published in July 1943, provides standardized training materials. Related technical orders specify inspection intervals, leak test procedures, acceptable torque values for hose clamps, and replacement criteria for rubber components. The altitude training program, using low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, exposes crews to their personal hypoxia symptoms. By late 1944, the AAF operates 65 altitude chambers and has trained 623,000 airmen in oxygen discipline. But technical orders and training programs achieve nothing without rigorous execution. The decisive implementation occurs in dimly lit equipment shops at bomber bases across England and Italy, where personal equipment men work in conditions barely warmer than the ambient temperature, often under pressure to turn aircraft around for the next day's mission. These are the men, staff sergeants, corporals, privates first class, whose names appear only in unit rosters, but whose work directly affects whether crews survive at 25,000 feet. A wartime equipment manual specifies the procedure. Report to crew chief and personal equipment officer on landing any and all faulty oxygen equipment. Make sure repairs to such equipment have been made before next flight. The system depends on crews reporting defects, riggers diagnosing root causes, and officers enforcing compliance. Medical officers track incident rates by group, creating statistical feedback that identifies units with effective oxygen maintenance programs and those requiring improvement. By mid-1943, the organizational infrastructure exists. The technical standards are documented. The training pipeline is functioning. Now the question is whether frontline riggers can translate paper procedures into masks and hoses that actually stay sealed at altitude. A flight surgeon at a bomber base reviews a stack of mission debrief forms from the past week's operations. 3 crews reported oxygen-related incidents: a navigator who became confused and disoriented at 23,000 feet, a ball turret gunner who blacked out briefly, and a radio operator whose mask froze solid, forcing an emergency descent. Each incident represents a mission objective potentially compromised, a crew member's life endangered, and, when multiplied across hundreds of bomber groups flying thousands of sorties, an operational problem that threatens the entire strategic bombing campaign. Medical officers and PEOs begin systematic analysis. They categorize incidents by type: crew error, failing to go on oxygen at the prescribed altitude, improper mask donning; equipment failure, frozen valves, leaking seals, disconnected hoses; and aircraft damage, oxygen system hit by flak or fighter attack. The data reveal that crew error and equipment failure dominate the statistics, both problems addressable through training and maintenance. Incident tracking distinguishes between catastrophic failures, complete loss of oxygen leading to immediate crew incapacity, and insidious failures, slow leaks or partial blockages that degrade performance gradually. Catastrophic failures are obvious and force immediate action. Insidious failures are more dangerous because crews may not recognize impairment until judgment is already compromised. Medical research shows that hypoxia produces euphoria and overconfidence before unconsciousness. A pilot losing oxygen may feel fine even as his ability to fly the aircraft deteriorates. An archival medical summary states, "Medics at High Wycombe also helped prevent anoxia deaths at high altitudes." The Central Medical Establishment coordinates with the Aero Medical Laboratory at Wright Field, sharing field data and receiving updated technical guidance. Patterns emerge. Masks that pass static ground tests fail under vibration and cold. Hose connections that appear secure loosen after several high-altitude missions. Face seals that fit correctly when new degrade after exposure to sweat, oil, and temperature extremes. The most valuable insight is also the most challenging. Many oxygen failures result not from catastrophic defects, but from small mechanical degradations that accumulate over time. This means prevention requires not just initial quality control, but sustained, detailed inspection and maintenance between every mission. Technical orders arrive at bomber stations in England and Italy. Thick manuals, stamped and logged, containing the accumulated wisdom of Wright Field engineers, Mayo Clinic physiologists, and field experience from combat operations. Technical Order 0351, Use of Oxygen and Oxygen Equipment, specifies inspection procedures, maintenance intervals, and troubleshooting protocols. Technical Order 035031, Handbook on Pressure Breathing Demand Oxygen Equipment, provides detailed guidance on regulators and high-altitude systems. Technical Order 002513, Your Body in Flight, illustrated by Eric Sloan, explains altitude physiology in terms a crew member can understand. For personal equipment riggers, these manuals become operational scripture. The technical orders specify acceptable hose clamp types and installation torque values, leak test methods using pressure gauges and soapy water, inspection criteria for rubber face pieces, including acceptable levels of wear, cracking, and deformation, regulator adjustment procedures for different altitude profiles, replacement intervals for components subject to wear, and reporting requirements for defects discovered during inspection. The procedures are detailed and unforgiving. A typical mask inspection sequence requires visual examination of the rubber facepiece for cracks, tears, or hardening. Check of the head harness for proper tension and secure attachment points. Inspection of exhalation valves for freedom of movement and sealing capability. Examination of the demand valve interface for proper fit and gasket condition. Inspection of the corrugated hose for kinks, cuts, or degradation. Verification that hose end fittings are properly seated and clamped. Leak test of the complete assembly under pressure, and functional test of the demand regulator across its operating range. Each bomber carries 10 oxygen stations: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. Each station requires a mask, hose, and connections maintained to technical order specifications. A bomber group with 40 aircraft represents 400 oxygen systems, requiring inspection between missions. The arithmetic is unforgiving. A personal equipment section with 10 enlisted men working 8-hour shifts must inspect, repair, and test 40 systems per day to maintain readiness. The manuals provide the standard. Meeting that standard under operational pressure requires skill, dedication, and an understanding that lives depend on getting every detail correct. The personal equipment shop occupies a corner of a maintenance hangar, separated from the main floor by plywood partitions. Wooden workbenches hold racks of A14 masks, spools of rubber hose, boxes of metal clamps and fittings, and the specialized tools of the oxygen rigger's trade. Torque wrenches calibrated for hose clamp installation, pressure gauges for leak testing, inspection mirrors, and lights for examining valve seats, small brushes for cleaning exhalation ports, and containers of approved lubricants and sealants. A staff sergeant, promoted from private first class after demonstrating exceptional skill in parachute rigging, instructs 2 new arrivals on mask inspection procedures. He demonstrates the critical sequence. Examine the face seal for hardening or cracking by flexing the rubber between thumb and forefinger, feeling for loss of elasticity that indicates degradation. Check the exhalation valves by blowing gently into the mask and feeling for resistance, listening for the characteristic flutter as the valve opens and closes. Inspect hose end fittings using a gauge to verify the internal diameter hasn't been distorted by over-tightening or impact. Test the clamp torque using a calibrated wrench. Too loose and the connection will leak or separate under vibration. Too tight and the fitting crushes, creating stress points that propagate into cracks. The sergeant explains failure modes from field experience. Masks freeze at altitude when moisture from exhaled breath condenses in the inlet ports and freezes solid, blocking oxygen flow. This failure emerged only after extended operations in winter conditions. Laboratory tests at Wright Field hadn't replicated the specific combination of breathing patterns, humidity, and temperature cycles encountered on actual missions. The field solution, an 8th Air Force modification adding internal baffles to redirect airflow away from the coldest surfaces, was developed by personal equipment specialists working with flight surgeons and distributed via technical order supplement. Hose connections loosen under vibration because standard clamps, adequate for ground applications, don't account for the sustained vibration environment of bomber operations. The solution requires using clamps with locking mechanisms and applying specific torque values verified by experimentation. Face seals degrade because rubber exposed to temperature extremes, skin oils, and mechanical stress ages rapidly. The solution requires more frequent replacement than originally specified, based on calendar time rather than flight hours. Each fix is small, technical, unglamorous. Each fix, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of sorties, moves the needle on survival statistics. Dr. Clayton S. White, working with William R. Lovelace II at the Aero Medical Laboratory, conducts systematic tests of A14 oxygen masks after combat units report blackouts attributed to mask freezing. White tests 3 variants: the original A-14 design, a Wright Field laboratory modification, and an 8th Air Force field modification developed by personal equipment specialists in response to operational failures. He subjects each variant to cold chamber tests simulating altitude and temperature profiles from actual missions, using mannequin heads that replicate breathing patterns and moisture generation. The results are sobering, White later states in an oral history. None of the 3 A-14 modifications was worth a damn because they did not avoid freezing in the oxygen inlet ports. The laboratory tests reveal the mechanism. Exhaled breath, saturated with moisture from the lungs, cools rapidly as it exits the mask through exhalation valves. Some moisture condenses inside the mask. Normal head movement causes condensed water to migrate toward the oxygen inlet. At altitude temperatures, typically -40 to -60 degrees Fahrenheit outside the aircraft and often below freezing inside unpressurized bombers, the water freezes solid, progressively blocking oxygen flow until the inlet is completely obstructed. The A-14 was designed to be frost-proof based on laboratory testing that didn't fully replicate operational conditions. The gap between laboratory environment and combat reality illustrates a fundamental challenge. Ground testing, even in sophisticated cold chambers and altitude simulators, can't perfectly reproduce the complex interaction of factors present on actual missions. Extended duration at altitude, specific patterns of crew movement and breathing, vibration transmitted through the aircraft structure, and the thermal environment of different crew positions all affect oxygen system performance in ways difficult to predict from bench tests. The solution emerges not from a single engineering breakthrough, but from incremental field modifications informed by systematic analysis of failure reports. Personal equipment sections adopt procedures including pre-flight warming of masks to drive off any residual moisture, installation of simple heater elements near inlet ports where electrical power is available, redesigned baffles that use exhaled breath to warm inlet areas, and crew training emphasizing the importance of keeping masks properly positioned to minimize moisture migration. Flight surgeons and PEOs share successful modifications between groups, creating an informal but effective network for rapid dissemination of solutions. By mid-1944, mask freezing incidents decline sharply, not because a perfect cold-proof mask is developed, but because riggers implement multiple small improvements that collectively manage the problem. The altitude training program formally integrates with personal equipment maintenance in May 1943. The concept is simple but powerful. Use altitude chamber sessions not just to train crews in recognizing hypoxia symptoms, but to identify equipment defects before they cause failures on combat missions. Trainees wear their actual service masks, the same A-14 assemblies they'll use at operational altitude. Personal equipment specialists attend chamber runs, observing mask performance and crew technique. The integration reveals problems invisible in static inspections. A mask that passes ground leak tests may fail in the chamber when the wearer moves his head, talks, or breathes heavily. A face seal adequate for a stationary crew member on the ground may leak when the wearer is performing tasks under simulated combat stress. Hose connections that appear secure may separate when subjected to the physical demands of manning a gun position or navigating in turbulence. Defects discovered in the chamber drive immediate maintenance action. A rigger notes that a trainee's mask leaks at the right cheek seal. After the chamber run, the rigger examines the mask and discovers the rubber has hardened in that specific area, creating a gap too small to detect by visual inspection, but large enough to cause progressive oxygen loss at altitude. The mask is removed from service and the rigger inspects other masks from the same production batch, finding similar hardening patterns. A technical order supplement updates replacement criteria. By late 1944, approximately 623,000 airmen have received altitude chamber training using 65 operational chambers. Each chamber run generates equipment feedback. Personal equipment officers track maintenance actions prompted by training discoveries, creating a documented link between chamber findings and field improvements. Units with active altitude training programs and engaged personal equipment sections show measurably lower operational hypoxia rates than units treating training and maintenance as separate activities. An official history later states, "The value of the altitude training program can be appreciated when it is remembered that the safe operation of thousands of bomber missions over Europe was largely dependent on oxygen discipline." Oxygen discipline encompasses both human factors, crew training and procedural compliance, and hardware factors, equipment condition and maintenance quality. The integration of training and maintenance creates a system where neither element alone would be sufficient, but together they achieve results that seem statistically impossible. Air Force medical statisticians compile annual data on oxygen-related incidents. The numbers tell a story that operational commanders initially find difficult to believe. Between November 1943 and November 1944, a period encompassing the most intensive phase of the strategic bombing campaign, anoxia accident rates among heavy bomber crews declined by approximately 80%. Anoxia-related fatality rates dropped by 68%. These reductions occurred despite a more than 100-fold increase in man sorties flown and a 5,000-foot increase in average bombing altitude from approximately 22,000 to 27,000 feet. The statistical summary requires careful interpretation. Total hypoxia incidents across all USAF operations during the war numbered 10,700, with 110 deaths directly attributed to oxygen system failures and between 0.3 and 0.6% of all sorties aborted due to oxygen problems. These aggregate numbers mask the dramatic improvement concentrated in heavy bomber operations in 1944 and 1945. Early war incident rates were substantially higher, particularly in 1942 and early 1943, when training programs were not yet mature and maintenance procedures were still being developed. The improvement is not uniform across all units. Groups with experienced personal equipment officers and well-trained rigger sections achieve low incident rates early. Groups with high personnel turnover or less rigorous maintenance discipline continue experiencing problems until command emphasis and additional training bring their performance in line with theater standards. Medical officers track performance by group, creating statistical pressure for improvement and providing quantitative evidence that systematic maintenance works. From an engineering perspective, the reduction represents the systematic elimination of failure modes. Each type of defect, loose hose clamps, degraded face seals, frozen inlet ports, stuck exhalation valves, has a statistical probability of occurring per flight hour. Maintenance procedures that detect and correct these defects before flight reduce the probability to near zero. Multiply this reduction across all defect types and all oxygen systems in a bomber, and the cumulative effect is a transformation from an unreliable system with frequent failures to a reliable system where failures become rare. From a human perspective, the numbers represent bomber crews who complete missions without losing consciousness at altitude, navigate accurately to targets, operate defensive guns effectively, and return safely to base, because someone in a cold equipment shop correctly tightened a hose clamp and verified a mask seal. Operations orders arrive at 1800 hours. Maximum effort tomorrow. Target Munich. Estimated altitude 26,000 feet. Duration 9 hours. The personal equipment section receives the alert. 40 B-17s flying, 10 oxygen systems per aircraft, 400 complete assemblies requiring inspection and preparation tonight. The PEO, a first lieutenant who was a commercial pilot before the war, briefs his section. 10 enlisted men, ranging from staff sergeants with 2 years' experience to privates first class newly arrived from technical school. The work will continue through the night. Each man is assigned 4 aircraft, 40 oxygen systems. The standard requires each system inspected, leak-tested, and certified ready before a crew briefing at 0400 hours. A staff sergeant begins his sequence on the first aircraft. He removes each mask from its stowage position, working from front to rear. Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, engineer, top turret, radio operator, ball turret, left waist, right waist, tail. Each mask gets the same systematic inspection. Visual examination of the rubber facepiece, checking for cracks, tears, or hardening, flex the rubber, feel for loss of elasticity. Head harness inspection, verifying strap adjustment and buckle security. Exhalation valve check, blowing gently to confirm free movement and proper sealing. Demand valve interface examination, checking gasket condition and seating. The hose and connection inspection requires particular care. The sergeant examines each corrugated hose along its full length, looking for kinks, cuts, or degradation. He checks hose end fittings, verifying proper seating in the connector. He uses a torque wrench to confirm clamp tension, 15 inch-pounds per technical order 0351. Too loose and vibration will work the connection open. Too tight and the fitting crushes, creating stress concentrations that lead to cracking. With the mask assembly inspected, the sergeant connects it to the aircraft oxygen system and performs a pressure leak test. He closes the demand valve, pressurizes the system to operational pressure, and uses soapy water on all connections, watching for bubbles that indicate leaks. A tiny leak at the hose clamp, barely visible bubbles forming slowly. The sergeant loosens the clamp, reseats the fitting, and retorques. Second test, no leaks. He marks the inspection tag, signs it, and moves to the next position. By 0300 hours, all 40 aircraft are certified ready. The riggers have inspected 400 oxygen systems, corrected 37 minor defects, and removed 5 masks from service for major repair. Tomorrow, 400 men will breathe at 26,000 feet for 9 hours, trusting equipment prepared by men whose names they don't know. Mission planners plot raids against oil refineries at Ploesti, aircraft factories at Regensburg, and ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The altitude profile for most missions settles at 25,000 to 27,000 feet, high enough to reduce flak effectiveness while maintaining formation integrity. These altitudes, considered experimental and risky in early 1943, become routine by mid-1944. The transformation reflects not improved aircraft performance. B-17s and B-24s remain fundamentally unchanged, but improved physiological support systems. Reliable oxygen enables sustained operations at altitudes and durations that would have been physiologically unsustainable without the maintenance and training improvements. A typical mission to targets deep in Germany requires crews to remain on oxygen for 7 to 10 hours. Any oxygen system failure during this period compromises the mission and endangers the crew. The documented reduction in anoxia incidents, from frequent occurrences in early operations to rare events by late war, directly enables the strategic bombing campaign's expansion and intensification. The operational impact manifests in multiple ways. Fewer aborts due to crew incapacity mean more bombs on target per mission launched. Reduced anoxia incidents mean fewer aircraft vulnerable due to incapacitated gunners or pilots. Lower fatality rates from oxygen failures preserve trained crews who represent months of investment in training and experience. Consistent operations at higher altitudes improve survival rates by reducing flak effectiveness, creating a compound benefit where better oxygen systems enable higher altitude, which reduces combat losses. Official AAF medical histories explicitly characterize oxygen programs as a direct contribution to combat effectiveness rather than merely a supporting service. The statement reflects recognition that in high-altitude warfare, life support systems are not auxiliary equipment, but mission-critical systems equivalent in importance to engines, fuel, and armament. A B-17 with perfect engines but failed oxygen systems cannot complete its mission. A bomber force with unreliable oxygen systems cannot sustain strategic operations at the altitudes necessary for mission success. By autumn 1944, oxygen reliability is high enough that mission planners routinely schedule operations requiring sustained periods at 27,000 feet without special provision for oxygen-related contingencies. The system has become reliable enough to be taken for granted, the ultimate validation of the riggers' technical work and the training programs that support them. What seemed impossible in early 1943, routine, reliable high-altitude operations across an entire Air Force, has become standard procedure. The war ends, but the oxygen system's knowledge developed by combat experience becomes institutional doctrine. The publication of medical support of the Army Air Forces in World War II in 1955 codifies lessons learned. Post-war technical orders incorporate field modifications developed by personal equipment sections during combat operations. The role of aeromedical officers in accident investigation, initially an ad hoc response to hypoxia incidents, becomes formalized in Air Force regulations and NATO standards. Wright Field engineers incorporate wartime feedback into improved oxygen mask designs for jet aircraft and high-altitude reconnaissance platforms. The fundamental insights remain valid even as technology evolves. Laboratory testing must be validated by operational experience. Maintenance quality directly affects system reliability. Training must integrate human factors and equipment condition, and small mechanical details, torque values, seal materials, inspection intervals, have strategic consequences at operational scale. The altitude training program continues, expanding to include pressure suit operations and familiarization with even higher altitudes as jet bombers reach 40,000 feet and above. The fundamental concept, expose operators to physiological stress under controlled conditions using actual operational equipment, proves applicable across generations of aircraft. Modern altitude chambers still follow principles established in World War II. Demonstrate hypoxia symptoms to each individual, teach recognition of early warning signs, practice emergency procedures, and identify equipment problems before they cause operational failures. A NATO aeromedical standard from the jet age states, "A medical officer will participate, when possible, in the investigation of all aviation accidents and/or incidents." The language reflects institutional recognition that human-equipment interaction requires medical expertise for proper understanding. The oxygen system, once viewed primarily as an engineering problem, is now understood as a human-machine system where physiology, psychology, training, and hardware engineering intersect. The World War II experience establishes a template: detailed technical standards, rigorous training programs, systematic maintenance procedures, and statistical tracking of performance. This template applies beyond oxygen systems to all aspects of aviation life support, and more broadly, to any complex system where human operators depend on reliable equipment under physiological stress. The riggers who tightened hose clamps in cold equipment shops built more than reliable oxygen systems. They built an institutional understanding of how technical precision enables operational capability. The final accounting is precise but incomplete. Official statistics record 10,700 hypoxia incidents, 110 deaths directly attributed to oxygen system failures, and approximately 0.3 to 0.6% of sorties aborted due to oxygen problems across all USAF operations during World War II. Medical program assessments document an 80% reduction in anoxia accidents among heavy bomber crews in the final year of the war, accompanied by a 68% reduction in associated fatalities. These reductions occurred despite more than a 100-fold increase in man sorties and a 5,000-foot increase in average bombing altitude. The numbers are accurate but abstract. They represent bomber crews who completed missions to Berlin, Schweinfurt, Ploesti, and Vienna without losing consciousness at altitude. They represent navigators who maintained accurate course calculations despite 8 hours on oxygen at 27,000 feet. They represent gunners who remained alert and effective, pilots who flew precise formations, and bombardiers who delivered accurate attacks, all dependent on oxygen systems maintained to exacting standards by men whose work was almost invisible. No medals were awarded for correctly torquing a hose clamp. No campaign ribbons recognized the rigger who discovered that a particular batch of rubber-faced seals degraded prematurely and initiated a service-wide replacement before failures occurred. No individual names appear in most official histories for the staff sergeants and corporals who worked. Through cold nights inspecting masks, testing connections, and certifying oxygen systems ready for the next day's maximum effort. Yet their contribution is measurable in the most fundamental terms: missions completed, lives preserved, strategic objectives achieved. The 70 to 80% reduction in anoxia accidents at altitude represents one of the sharpest statistical improvements in the entire air war. Unlike improvements from new aircraft types, upgraded weapons, or tactical innovations, this improvement came from systematic application of technical knowledge by skilled specialists working with existing equipment. The story of USAAF oxygen systems is not a story of dramatic invention or heroic breakthrough. It is a story of institutional learning, technical standards, rigorous training, and meticulous maintenance. It demonstrates that in complex military operations, unglamorous technical work can have strategic impact. A loose hose clamp is a maintenance defect. 10,000 loose hose clamps become an operational problem. Systematic procedures that eliminate those defects across an entire air force become a combat multiplier as significant as additional aircraft or improved weapons. The B-17 crews who flew to Germany at 27,000 feet trusted their lives to oxygen systems prepared by personal equipment riggers. Most crews never met the men who inspected their masks, tightened their hose clamps, and certified their equipment ready. But that trust was earned through thousands of careful inspections, correct torque applications, and systematic adherence to technical standards. The trust was not misplaced. In an air war measured by tonnage delivered and targets destroyed, the decisive contribution of oxygen system maintenance appears in negative space. Missions not aborted, crews not lost to hypoxia, combat effectiveness not degraded by physiological failures. The improvement from unreliable oxygen systems causing thousands of incidents to reliable systems enabling routine high-altitude operations represents a transformation in capability. That transformation was built by riggers, one correctly tightened clamp at a time. The final numbers bear repeating: 10,700 incidents across the war, 110 deaths, and an 80% reduction in accident rates among heavy bomber crews when training and maintenance programs reached maturity. Behind those numbers stand the personal equipment specialists whose names rarely appear in histories, but whose technical competence made high-altitude strategic bombing operationally feasible. Their work left no contrails, but it enabled the aircraft that did.